Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so privileged here at the Chelmsford Public Library tonight to have a presentation with Marina Kirsch. She will be discussing her book, Flight of Remembrance. Our presenter today is Marina Kirsch. She will talk about her family's experience in Latvia, occupied Poland, and Germany before, during, and after World War II, as recorded in her book, Flight of Remembrance. Her presentations, given at over 115 venues in 13 states, provide a unique perspective while helping to preserve the memories of World War II and the Holocaust. Her presentation will include parallels to the current conflict in Ukraine, and it encourages audiences to share their personal and collective memories, as well as adopting a lifelong dream, goal, and vision powered by love and supported by faith. Marina immigrated to the US with her family after World War II and has lived in lots of places. She is currently a resident of Kensington in southern New Hampshire. And in addition to being an author, Marina is mostly a retired freelance graphic designer, book designer, and editor. She is also a New Hampshire humanities speaker and an officer and a distinguished Toastmaster with the Exeter Speak Ups Club in Exeter, New Hampshire. She considers connecting with audiences a great privilege. So thank you so much for being here, Marina. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to you. I will be listening and be on the back end to help with any sort of coordination that I can.
Thank you very much, Marty, and welcome everyone. I'm so delighted to be here with you tonight. I only wish I could see you. So today is March 13th, and I have spoken in 13 states so far, and I've been doing this for 13 years about my family's story. I think that might be a very auspicious number. In addition, today would be the 104th birthday of my mother, Lilo, who is one of the two main protagonists of my family's story. So a few opening comments about Zoom. So it's sometimes great, you can have people attend who otherwise might not be able to make it, but there are disadvantages. One of them is you can't buy a book from me personally, although you could via my website or sending me an order. I can't get mailing list signups as easily. And worst of all, I can't see you and speak to you face to face. However, we're going to make the best of this. And when the first slide comes on, once I share my screen, at the bottom of that slide are my email address and my web URL. Feel free to take that down. But also, if you look in the chat column, you will see there are 3 files that you can download. There is a suggested World War II reading list. There is a speaker flyer about my events, and there is a book promo card about my book. In addition, my email address and website are there as well. And they will also appear on the very last slide of my presentation. I'll be asking a few questions during this presentation. What I'd like you to do, if you are able, is to put answers into chat if you have an answer that you think applies. And in addition, put your questions in there as well, and we will address them at the end of the program. And now, I would like to warmly welcome you to Flight of Remembrance. Is there value in a story from the losing side of a world conflict? That, my friends, is a question that I pondered for a long, long time. In fact, over the course of many years, because my family's story is from the Axis side of World War II, and it even includes 2 German veterans. Germany not only lost that war, but in addition was the chief aggressor that directly or indirectly caused the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide. That is an awesome figure to contemplate. And today we might actually need a new perspective on those figures because, after all, defense and relief budgets are in the billions. We hardly even think about millions anymore, and some things are even up in the trillions. So here we go. If you buried 10 people per day, it would take more than 13,000 years to bury 50 million people, and more than 19,000 years to bury 70 million. World War II was a conflict without precedent. This evening, you'll hear part of my family's story as recorded in my book, Flight of Remembrance. The two main protagonists are my parents, Rolf Dutzman, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lila Wasul, the young woman he met in 1940 Berlin. Way back in 2004, when I thought maybe, just maybe, I would try to turn this family story into a screenplay, someone in my screenwriting course said, but it's a story about Nazis. I actually had to think a lot more and ponder a lot more about that comment, even though the person who said it wasn't aware that no one on either side of my family supported Hitler or joined the Nazi Party. That is a fact that surprises many people who attend my programs because they think everyone in Germany must have been a Nazi. Well, actually, not so. What's to be gained from this family story? Are there takeaways? And I would say yes. So, unfortunately, humanity doesn't seem to learn from the past. Dictators still rise, wars are waged, genocide is perpetrated. But the problem is that we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. So here are 5 takeaways. First, it promotes remembrance of World War II and the Holocaust at a time when eyewitnesses are disappearing rapidly. It serves a therapeutic purpose by giving a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy, rather than denying or burying the past. It clarifies the ravages of war waged on home soil on the losing side, and that has only happened here in the US one time during the Civil War. It also gives a clearer sense of what the people of Ukraine are experiencing today, those who fight and those who flee. It gives some of the warning signs and perils of dictatorship and affirms the value of love, dreams, and faith in an infinite higher being or God, because it is that which helps to give life meaning and prevents despair. It promotes survival in adversity and also addresses those deepest questions in life that we all have. I'd like to ask you 2 questions now. So this is a good time for you to put answers into chat. Did you have ancestors who served in World War II on either side? Please put into chat if you are able. So in my live presentations, I have people raise their hands. We talk about it a little bit. I ask them where they served, which branch of the military. Next, I'd like to ask you whether anyone in your extended ancestry served on the Axis side of the war. So that would be Germany, Italy, Japan, or the lesser Axis nations. If so, and if you're able to put that into chat, that might lead to some interesting discussion at the end of this program. Next question. Did you or your ancestors live during World War II in countries where the war was fought? So that would be almost anywhere in Europe, parts of the Soviet Union, Philippines, China, Japan, North Africa, even Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor happened. Please put that into chat as well. Now, I'll give you my family's story in a nutshell from the cover of my book. The guy with the helmet, my father, Rolf Dutzman, who fled Latvia with his family from Latvia to Germany before the first Soviet takeover. By this time, he is 22 years old, and he has been drafted into the German Luftwaffe, which is the Air Force. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, wedding day, 1944. My older brother Ingo at age 2, born in post-war Germany during pretty hard times. Flying in up top, an illustration that I did from a photograph of my father Rolf flying a pre-World War II Latvian glider. That little icon represents two things. First of all, Rolf's overarching goal in life to further the field of aeronautical engineering. It was his dream. It was his passion. It was his goal in life. But it also represents, that little icon also represents my quest to gain a higher and wider perspective on World War II through the researching, the writing, and now the sharing of my family's story. Inevitably, there are people at my events who give me missing pieces of the World War II story, like a man who attended in Pembroke, New Hampshire a couple of months ago and told me a little bit about World War II in Finland, which I had no idea about. Amazing, amazing facts. So I thank all of you in advance if you are able to also further my understanding. And here is the finalist award symbol from the 2012 Best Book Awards in the narrative nonfiction category. My book reads like a novel, but it does have footnotes, appendices, an index, and a number of other features that sometimes nonfiction will have, because it's a true story. I hope that some of you have read this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It is an amazing, life-changing book. If you can put your email address into chat, I will send you my suggested reading list and also add you to my mailing list for events. I would love if you would do that. If you ever want to unsubscribe, it's easy to do. A single click will do it. And this book by Frankl is on that list. The list includes not only books about World War II, but also books and videos on existential topics, because Frankl's book actually fulfills both. Frankl was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who, after the war, formed the third Viennese school of psychotherapy called logotherapy, which helps people find meaning in life. Frankl wrote, "Nothing in the world would so help one to survive even the worst of conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life." And Frankl found meaning even at Auschwitz. So if Frankl could do that, then perhaps we all can find meaning no matter what the adversity is that we're facing in our lives. My parents and grandparents never knew about Frankl, and yet their lives illustrate key concepts of logotherapy. It was love, it was their dreams, it was their faith, their Catholic and Lutheran faith, that helped them to find meaning, make wise decisions, and to visualize a life beyond the cataclysm that was coming. It is meaning, friends, that enables us to be the architects of our individual and collective future. And my hope is that you will find encouragement from my family story, from Frankl's book, and maybe from some of the other sources on my list that will help you to face adversity in your own life. Let's time travel now to 1924 Latvia. The little boy, second from left, is my father, Rolf, with his mother, Maria, little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst, in Latvian military uniform. Ernst had a dream. Do you see a theme developing here? From the youngest age, sitting on a hillside of his family's farm in Latvia and gazing out toward a sliver of the Baltic Sea on the horizon. His dream was always the same, to be captain of a ship bound for America. But that wasn't possible for him or for a lot of other people before or during World War II. My father, Rolf, at left here in this photograph, had been building model gliders for many years from plans in American and German magazines. By this time, he is already fluent in English, a skill that would save his life toward the end of the war. And by age 18, he's winning national awards for his gliders. He is also in the process of building a full-size motorized plane and a full-sized manned glider. Here he is flying that glider, and this is the photograph from which I created the illustration on my cover. The photo was just not clear enough to use there. Rolf was with a group of young men called the Izargs, the closest thing that Latvia had to a national guard in the window of peace between World War I and World War II. But the Izargs were permanently disbanded as soon as the Soviets took over. Now here you'll notice that my grandmother, Maria, was wearing the same museum quality dress in 1935 that I sometimes still wear today. I wear it less often these days. I used to wear it for every presentation. Now my emphasis is more on preservation, and also it takes a bit of time to get in and out of it, along with the jewelry that I'm wearing in the photograph at right. That dress was tailored and embroidered by Maria in the early 1930s. She wore it for only a few years, and then it got packed away very carefully. She altered it to fit me when I was 16 years old. And the brooch that I'm wearing in the photograph is called a Kurzem brooch from the southwestern region of Latvia where the family lived, on the Baltic Sea. Those brooches were worn by women to designate the family's wealth. We have a collection of those, and in addition, we have lots of my grandmother's beautiful needlework. We have tons of photographs, documents, and letters from World War II and far before World War II, in fact. I used 132 photographs in my book, but I was choosy. I actually could have included a lot more than that. However, what is the greatest treasure that I own when it comes to family memorabilia, documents, etc.? It is a book that Rolf and Lilo wrote in the early 1990s of family history. And when I held that book in my hands and I read it for the first time, I realized my family's story is a treasure. And I realized that I'm going to have to share it. Perhaps there are things in your own background that are worth sharing with others. Consider that. To set the stage for the next part of the story, I usually have people shout this out. Maybe you know the answer. Which country was most feared across Europe during World War II, especially by people of German heritage? Well, you can't shout it out in a way that I can hear you, and so I will just tell you. Russia or Soviet Union. I use the terms interchangeably. Churchill once mentioned Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and that was to describe the menace that Russia posed to all of Europe. And that menace has resurfaced in current times via Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Joseph Stalin, Russia's leader at the time, though likable and fatherly on the surface, hey, Roosevelt and Churchill actually enjoyed his company, but he was in actuality one of the most brutal and oppressive dictators and mass murderers of all time. The paradox of this situation is that Russia lost more citizens and military personnel in World War II than any other country, by far. Russia's involvement was essential to the Allies winning the war. But in the eastern part of Europe, Russia or the Soviet Union was feared every bit as much or more than Nazi Germany. And that is a fact that's important for you to absorb as I continue this story, because it sets the stage for what it was like for people in Eastern Europe. In October 1939, Rolf, remember his goal, aeronautical engineering. He had just started his studies at the University of Riga when an ominous phone call came from his father Ernst, urging him to come home immediately. A Soviet takeover was imminent. And unlike Ukraine today, the small Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia knew that they were powerless to prevent a takeover from either brutal dictatorship. They never declared war on Germany or on the Soviet Union. Rolf and family, like millions, maybe hundreds of millions, of people of German descent scattered all across the face of Europe, were at a much greater risk of deportation or execution under a Soviet takeover. And yet, the only country that would accept German refugees, that is, people of German heritage, they may have been born in these other countries, but if they were of German heritage, the only country willing to take them was Nazi Germany. My grandfather Ernst was especially at risk. He had served as a Tsarist Russian officer in World War I, a Latvian officer between the two world wars, and he was an outspoken anti-communist. To the Dutzman family in 1939, the verdict on the Hitler regime, the Nazi regime, was still out, but the Stalin regime had long been recognized as a brutal, oppressive regime with little or no respect for human life. They could have given in to despair, but they didn't succumb to that. It was their love for each other, their goals for the future, and their faith in a God that cared about them that led them to make a life-saving decision. They decided to flee Latvia while they could. Here, Rolf, his mother Maria, and sister Ruth, in late 1939, shortly before they and 50,000 other Latvians of Baltic German heritage fled from Latvia to Germany by ship. Their sense of foreboding was chillingly accurate. Latvian officers who failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of Latvian citizens were either deported or executed. The presidents of Latvia and Estonia died in Siberia, and in Poland, another country that suffered terribly, maybe more so than any other country in Europe. In Poland, almost 22,000 military officers and intelligentsia were murdered in the Katyn forest by the Soviets, and it was pinned on Germany. The truth only came out after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The same fate, unfortunately, is likely today for Ukrainian officers and leaders if captured. The Baltic states, Poland, and Ukraine were caught between two brutal regimes, the Nazi German regime and the Soviet regime, and they suffered wave upon wave of tragedy. In Latvia, first, the Soviet takeover of 1940, followed by the German takeover of 1941, during which 75,000 Latvian Jews were heartlessly murdered. This photograph is from German military archives. And finally, in 1944, another brutal Soviet takeover, each time mass deportations and executions. In Eastern Europe, there was no right or wrong side to the war and no opportunity to remain neutral. Which regime took over determined who would live and who would die. And for people, especially of Baltic German heritage or people who were Jewish, that determination was mostly based on ancestry and ethnicity. German takeovers, mostly death sentences for Jews, were initially regarded as liberation by others for whom a Soviet takeover posed a far greater risk. I do want to mention this interesting fact. When the Jews in Estonia found out what had happened in Lithuania and Latvia, remember, this was early on in the war, and not too much was known yet about extermination of vulnerable groups like Jews. By the time the German troops got up to Estonia, the Estonian Jews had fled with the Soviet troops, and most of them survived in the Soviet Union. 75% of them fled to the Soviet Union, and the small percentage who stayed, almost all of them perished. Mark Twain once said, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography." Yes, indeed. Here is a map of December 1939, Northern Europe. Germany proper is in the tan, including East Prussia off to the right. In the darker tan, or light brown, some areas that Germany had already occupied, including the former Austria and half of the former Poland. The other half, partly off the edge of the map, taken over by the Soviet Union. Further north, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, the family lived right on the Baltic Sea, north of a city called Liepaja. Here comes Liepaja flying in. And north of there, Kara Osta, a smaller city which was a military enclave on the Baltic Sea, where my grandfather Ernst headed a department in a munitions laboratory. When the family fled, it was secretly. They told no one except for family members in advance. They fled from the capital city of Riga to an island that was part of Germany proper called Usedom. And as soon as their ship left the port city of Riga, they and the 2,000 other people on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people who were completely at the whim and mercy of Hitler and the Nazi regime. What happened next was one of the things they feared most. They spent a few months on the island, but then they were sent eastward to occupied Poland, one of the most dangerous, actually the most dangerous place in all of Europe at the time. First, to the city of Posen or Poznan. I initially give you both the German name of the city and the Polish name, but in next references, I will only use the Polish name. We need to go now to a different map in connection with the continuing war in Ukraine, because I think most people don't have a lot of knowledge about the EU and about NATO. So this map is primarily showing EU nations. I have to backtrack a little bit though. The United Nations was formed in 1945 at the close of World War II. But unfortunately, with the Soviet Union and now Russia on the Security Council, it is unable to do anything today about the war in Ukraine because Russia has full veto power. Fortunately, today, we have the powerful combo of the NATO military alliance formed in 1949 and the EU military alliance formed in 1993. And together they work to prevent another worldwide catastrophe. That is, I hope they will. Many of the nations on this map are members of both, but it's complicated. And the thing to remember is that the US and Canada, at least for now, are also members of NATO. In the medium green are the EU member nations, and they include Sweden and Finland, who, after the war in Ukraine commenced, also applied to NATO and were recently accepted. Non-EU nations are Switzerland, UK, and Norway. Switzerland, of course, being a neutral nation. United Kingdom and Norway are members of NATO, just not of the EU. Some additional non-EU nations are nations, some of whom would like to be members of the EU and NATO, like Ukraine and Moldova. But this group also includes a couple of nations that are members of NATO, including Turkey. Russian territory is in red, and a lot of it is off the map to the right. A huge, huge territory. And for all practical purposes, it should also include Belarus in the light red, a country that allowed Russian troops to cross into Ukraine across its southern border. Belarus is an ally of Russia. At the southern end of Ukraine, you'll see a little peninsula. Actually, it's not so little. It's a Crimean peninsula, or Crimea, which was taken over by Russia in 2014. Now, what in the world, you might ask, is that sliver of red between Poland and Lithuania? That sliver of red is something that even I knew nothing about until after the war in Ukraine commenced. Normally in my live presentations, I ask, does anyone know what that is? But now I have to tell you. It is Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad used to be East Prussia, that part of Germany proper off to the east, which after World War II was given to Russia in the Potsdam Agreement. And that little sliver of red today exponentially increases the risk to all of Europe, but especially to the Baltic states, which only have 65 miles of common border with any other NATO nation. In other words, with Poland, as you can see on the map. Other than that, they are completely surrounded by the Baltic Sea at their backs and Belarus and Russia, pro-Russian territory all around them. We in the US are so fortunate to have Canada and Mexico as our neighbors. Unlike Europe, which has had hostile nations all around it for the longest time. In fact, throughout its history, it has always had to worry, and it is worried today. Back to the family story. Rolf, en route to occupied Poland. He is dismayed, worried, apprehensive, writing in his diary, wondering whether the regime will immediately draft him or will they allow him to finish his education. His mother Maria, left in this photo, also pondering what the family's fate will be. In Poznan, they were accommodated in crude, unheated barracks. The food was equally dismal, and it was not a good life there. But fortunately, they didn't have to stay there long. As you can see, my grandfather Ernst is sleeping on the floor on straw. There were no mattresses. There were no beds. They were soon, to their dismay, sent even further east, closer to the Soviet threat, to Litzmannstadt or Łódź. Now, Łódź, I am pronouncing that correctly, but you might see it's spelled L-O-D-Z. And in Łódź, my grandfather Ernst could not find employment that was commensurate with his technical skills. The regime then, realizing that, sent the family to Berlin. And it was there in 1942 that Ernst was drafted as a major into the German army, the Wehrmacht. and then was sent back to the island of Usedom to a top secret installation called Peenemünde, where he trained under Werner von Braun for V-2 rocket inspection. That installation, though, was bombed in August of 1943 by the Allies, and the regime had found a safer place for mass production of the V-1 and the V-2 rockets. Here, near a town called Nordhausen in the heart of Germany, in the Harz Mountain region, and it is there that my grandfather Ernst was forced to work for the last 14 months of the war in a classified, that is top secret, underground installation where he served as chief inspector of the V-2. Did you see that dot flying in? Let me repeat that. So the city of Danzig or Gdańsk is on the Baltic Sea in the narrow corridor of German-occupied Poland. I will say a word or two about that city a bit later. Before I switch from this version of the map, please make note of the areas in tan and light brown, because those are Germany proper and the countries and areas that Germany had already annexed or taken over by March of 1940. Now, see the catastrophe that was Europe by June of 1944. Almost the entire continent was taken over by fascism, with the exception of the neutral countries of Switzerland, Sweden, and Finland, and off the map, the UK, Spain, and Portugal. Italy came into the war on the side of Nazi Germany, so Italy also was fascist. Now on to the other side of the story. My mother, Lilo Wasil. She is a little 2-year-old girl sitting between her parents, Gertrude and Walter. Lilo was born and raised in Berlin, had a somewhat different perspective on Hitler and the Nazi regime than my father did, who came in as a latecomer from another country. Here Lilo is 11 years old, and 2 years later, Hitler rose to power in Germany. But Lilo had a strong faith in God from a young age, and she refused to join the League of German Girls, equivalent to the Hitler Youth for boys. She told her mother, "They are sinister, fanatical, and atheistic. I want nothing to do with them." A few years after that, she decided to graduate a year early rather than face mandatory induction into a Nazi youth group the following year. Lilo had her principles that she wanted to maintain, and she witnessed how everything in Nazi Germany, from cradle to grave, soon came under Nazi domination. German World War II history. Oh, let's continue Lilo. Here she's age 19, and she also had a dream. It was for a harmonious, loving, and supportive home life and marriage, which didn't exist in her growing up years due to her parents' rocky marriage and their divorce when she was only 13. At this point in her life, Lilo's dream is about to commence because she would shortly meet Rolf at an afternoon dance at the Olympic Stadium Cafe in Berlin. World War II history is a cautionary tale. Conflict is often inspired by oppressive regimes such as the Hitler, Stalin, and Putin regimes. The common denominator, whether Nazi, fascist, communist, Marxist, doesn't matter what you want to call it, it's dictatorship. Hitler rose to power in only a few years' time, in increments and mostly by legal means, but without ever having a majority vote. What started as a personality cult in the late 1920s escalated into a brazen grasp for power by 1933, backed by a violent group of thugs called the Sturmabteilung, or the Brown Shirts. They were heavily armed. Hitler wasted no time in attacking and dismantling democratic institutions, imprisoning and murdering his opponents, but also imprisoning and murdering Jews, LGBTQ people, Gypsies or Roma, and other vulnerable groups. He betrayed the Brown Shirts as well. In 1934, he had them all murdered by the SS in the Night of the Long Knives. And by that time, Germany had completely morphed from a democracy with a free press to an absolute dictatorship under the pretense of restoring Germany's greatness. Hitler had no intention of ever stepping down from power. He also put a distorted version of Christianity in Germany called the Reich Church. The Reich Church denied the Jewish origins of Christianity. So in other words, Jesus wasn't a Jew, neither were the disciples. The Old Testament did not exist. And the Reich Church was hideously aligned with Nazi ideology. Unfortunately, for that reason, the majority of Christian people in Germany were either willingly or cluelessly complicit, not only in Hitler's rise to power, but also in everything that followed. There were dissenting Christians, thousands of them, primarily Catholic priests and lay people, and also some pastors and lay people from the Confessing Church of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They were deported, imprisoned, executed, right along with Jews and other vulnerable people. A warning is that Hitler wanted to completely eradicate not only Judaism, but also traditional Christianity from Germany. And today, we all have to be careful, not only to oppose distortion and depravity in government, but we need to also oppose it if it comes up in our faith tradition. Very important. Greek philosopher Plato said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power, and the price of apathy towards public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." Democracy across the globe is dependent on visa. Vigilant, informed, and socially active citizens of goodwill and integrity. In mid-1940, Rolf received the welcome news that he would be allowed to finish his aeronautical engineering education in the city of Gdańsk, which I showed you on the map, in that corridor of occupied Poland. He was relieved, and he hoped against hope that the war would be over long before he received his diploma. Now, the city of Gdańsk, once a free city of Europe, was by this time completely under Nazi control. In late 1941, Rolf's hopes came crashing down when the same day that he received his diploma, he also received his draft notice into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Here he's in uniform. He's reading the Berliner Illustrierte, a German newspaper, perhaps a story about the horrors of war waged on the Eastern Front with Russia. Hitler had betrayed Russia as well by attacking it earlier that year. Rolf was fortunate in that he was engaged in technical pursuits for much of the war. Initially, in airplane design and aerodynamics, he was teaching those subjects, and he was also engaging in glider flight and navigator training. These pursuits kept him from being sent to the front until very late in the war. And I'm also happy to report that he was never forced to fly any combat or bombing missions against the Allies. Now, during the war, 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany. We have no clue how many that was. Berlin alone, shown here on the map, flying in, sustained 363 air raids. But there were two cities in Germany that suffered even worse bombing in terms of the intensity and the resulting firestorms. Now, some of you might know which cities those are. In my live presentations, I ask people, shout it out, shout it out. But I guess I'm going to have to give you the answer. The two cities were Hamburg and Dresden. Here now is the ruined Dutzman family home in Berlin, bombed in March of 1944, the exterior and the interior. And the only reason we have these photographs is because Rolf took bombing leave to go and inspect the damage. And he had a camera with him, as usual. My mother, Lilo, her home was also destroyed, one floor at a time, until finally the top two floors blown away, walls and ceiling badly damaged, windows shattered, pipes burst, and water pouring into the apartment. She and my grandmother Gertrude could no longer live there. But the word of the Nazi regime, the rule was, no working person leaves Berlin. You had to have permission to even move out of the beleaguered city. But they persisted, and Love and Dreams, by this same month, March of 1944, by which time the bombing was already quite severe in Berlin, they were allowed to move to a town called Havelberg, which was northwest of the city and never got bombed. Perhaps that's the reason that their lives were spared. On a sad post note, though, all of Lila's relatives, except for her mother, and that included her father, remained trapped in what became the Soviet zone in Germany and later on East Berlin, and she never saw any of them again. Today, it is families in Ukraine that are being separated by the tragedy and the chaos of war. But the difference today, the EU exists to coordinate relief and resettlement. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather Ernst as chief inspector of the V2 rocket mass production at the underground installation of Mittelwerk, near that town called Nordhausen in the heart of Germany. I had to do a lot of research into my grandfather's role during the war because other than his title, we knew nothing. He never talked about it, not even to my father. Now imagine my alarm when I found out that there was a notorious, much feared, horrific slave labor camp located right outside the gates of this installation. Ernst was in charge of the inspection department, and he had more than 200 Army and civilian engineers and 3 inmates working in his department. I dreaded what else I might find out about my grandfather, this man who fed my brothers and me oatmeal in our high chairs, who told us jokes. He had a way of making us laugh all the time. He had a sparkling sense of humor, and he was kind. What would I find out? But to my relief, inmates had written books and post-war transcripts about their experience in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. And they mentioned that Major Dutzman of the Wehrmacht, my grandfather Ernst, had treated the inmates in his department with as much respect and kindness as he could. And he saved the life of Yuri Benish, a Czech inmate, who also wrote a book and post-war transcripts where he actually described many of his interactions and conversations with my grandfather. It's all in Czech, but I did get parts of it translated that deal with my grandfather. I have three regrets. Three. First, that I didn't know the questions to ask my grandfather when he was still alive. He would have given me candid answers, I know, because that's how he was. Second, that he may never have known that Yuri Benish survived the war. And third, that he may always be listed among the perpetrators just for having been forced to work in this place. Here is one of the underground tunnels at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp memorial as it looks today, with a lot of rubble still strewn on the floor of the tunnel. This was a vast, vast network of tunnels, which I visited in late 2011 to donate the photo that you just saw and some documents from my grandfather. And this concentration camp memorial exists only to commemorate the inmates who toiled and died, and not the advanced rocket technology that took place there. In November of 1944, with Allied troops poised to strike into Germany proper from the east, the west, and also from the south, a love story was unfolding that would continue over 70 years and across 2 continents. But the most dangerous times for German civilians and military personnel alike were still ahead. Within 6 months of these photographs, both Rolf and Ernst were taken prisoner of war, and Lilo and Gertrude would be forced to escape the encroaching Soviet troops on foot. They fled 120 miles on foot across mountainous terrain with only what they could hand carry. Perhaps the most devastating thing of all, though, was the uncertainty, because for almost a year after these wedding photographs, neither Rolf nor Lilo knew whether the other was still alive. In March of 1945, Rolf was working on a farm where he had been sent by the military. He was actually working on the farm for a time, but shortly after this photo was taken, notice he's taken a little hostage. He saved the life of a little kitten who was wandering around the farm, and gave it to the farm family when he left, because shortly after this photo was taken, he and tens of thousands of other military personnel were sent to the front. It was Rolf's worst nightmare coming to pass. And it was the Nazi regime's last desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. However, with weapons, personal weapons, none left to give out, and with many considering the war as good as over, Rolf's unit was ordered to disperse. And they did. Rolf walked 160 miles homeward cross country in late winter, hoping against hope that there was still a home and a family to return to. And my friends, that is the tragedy of war waged on home soil, is that not only military personnel, but homes, families, businesses, dreams, goals, everything is in harm's way. And that is what we see so tragically and chaotically playing out with the Ukrainian people today. Now, between this photo and the next, I am leaving out the most dramatic and cathartic part of the story for you to read about in the book. Because if I tried to tell you about it here, first, the ins and outs are a little complex. And also, we could be here all night with me telling you that part of the story. But you'll have to read in the book how love, dreams, faith in God, along with my grandmother Gertrude, my mother's mother, who is a major mover and shaker, especially in the post-war part of this story, forged a dramatic reunion and helped a family survive the most catastrophic war in human history. Here now, we're jumping to my favorite post-war photograph of Rolf and Lilo in Bavaria in 1949, and they were smiling down at my older brother Ingo, here at age 2, and by age 3, lo and behold, he has grown a tail sewn onto his overalls by our grandmother Maria, the same grandmother that made the beautiful embroidered dress. This is a good time for me to talk about what it's been like to be a child of German people. As children of German people, Ingo and I had lifelong questions about complicity and awareness. How much did they, our grandparents and our parents included, know about death camps and the Holocaust? After years of reading, research, and lots of discussions, including my parents when they were still alive, and they were still alive when I was writing my book, which I was so fortunate to still have them. But I realized after years of all of that, reading, research, discussions, that there's no simple answer. Although people in the upper echelons of the military, the government, and some industries, and also people who worked in the camp, had inside info and probably knew all of the gruesome facts, not everyone knew what happened there or who was sent there. What they did know, almost everybody across Germany, is that there were concentration camps. They knew that enemies of the regime were sent there, but actually who exactly and how were they treated? They might not have known that. Many were unaware of the death camps in Poland, and news reports claimed that deported people were being resettled on farms in Poland. Of course, today we know, tragically, what those farms were. Neither Nazi-controlled media nor Allied sources published accounts of the genocide during the war, and Nazi propaganda, like propaganda anywhere today, you name it, in Russia, in the US, anywhere, it kept many people in the dark and believing fabricated information. Rolf and Lilo were horrified to find out about the industrial scale genocide after the war ended, primarily from foreign magazines and newspapers, including the Stars and Stripes, which was American. How much did Ernst know? I have no way of knowing for sure. And Yuri Benish, the Czech inmate, even though he had been at 2 other concentration camps, including Auschwitz, he does not record having any conversations with Ernst about those camps. And the thing is, about the 2 camps that were affiliated with the installations where Ernst was forced to train and forced to work, a small one at Peenemünde under Werner von Braun, the rocket expert. You know, he was eventually brought to the US and he headed the US space program. Many of you have probably heard of him and know about him. There was a large camp, though, at Mittelwerk. And it was not, by and large, Jews and other persecuted groups who were sent there. Toward the end of the war, some Hungarian Jews were sent there. But by and large, it was resistance fighters and partisans from countries with which Germany was at war, captured ones who were sent there to slave, toil, and die. As a result, we will never know all the facts about what people knew. But there is a book on my suggested reading list entitled What We Knew. And Johnson and Rubin, the authors, after interviewing thousands of people, conclude that about 1/3 of the population in Germany knew everything, about 1/3 suspected but had no proof, and 1/3 was completely clueless. One thing is for sure. Very clear to me that we, all of us, ourselves, need to be the eyes, the ears, and the voice of remembrance for this tragic time in human history. And we must never, never let it be forgotten. Germany was a humanitarian disaster site after the war, inundated by 14 million homeless, hungry, starving refugees. Even my parents were starving. Everyone was. The worst thing of all, though, was the Soviet threat that still hung over all of Europe. Ernst convinced Rolf and Lilo that they should try to immigrate to America, if at all possible. And I would like to know, do we have any immigrants in the audience? If so, please let me know in chat if at all possible. Type in where you are from. If you're not an immigrant, but if your parents or grandparents were, let us know that too, and where they immigrated from. My family was enabled to immigrate to the US in December of 1951, thanks to the generosity and kindness of people in a tiny farming community in northern Indiana. And that part of my family's story, actually, everything from the immediate post-war time through immigration and then through early years in the US, I go into detail in a follow-up presentation that I offer about that time period. So hopefully you'll have me come back again. In any case, I will tell you one thing. When they left Germany in December of 1951, Lilo was 8 months pregnant. And when they arrived in Zurich, Switzerland, to get their flight to the US, there was fog covering all of Northern Europe. Fog so dense that that flight was delayed until the following morning. And that night, I took my opportunity to be born in a neutral country, and glad I was. 7 years later, we became naturalized citizens, all except for my younger brother Roland at lower left. And right around that time, in an amazing twist on a lifelong dream, my father's dream for a career in aeronautical engineering was not only not derailed by the chaos and destruction of World War II, but it actually expanded into a key role in the US space program. Because right around this time, right after naturalization, both Rolf and my grandfather Ernst were hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where Rolf headed a team of engineers that designed and built components of the Saturn 1B rocket. Those were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. So it's amazing to me and inspiring how his dream not only came to fruition, but expanded. After Rolf's retirement to New Hampshire in 1982, he spent over 30 years finding new meaning in his life by sharing his aerospace skills and enthusiasm and expertise with thousands of children and adults around the Granite State. He led model rocketry, he led young astronaut programs, and other programs as well. My parents' love story is as much about finding meaning, cherishing a dream, and living a life of faith in God as it is about surviving war. In this photograph, my mother Lilo has just turned 90. It was her 90th birthday, and she passed away only 2 years ago at age 102. In this final photograph, what we share, this photograph to me is a reminder that what we share lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. We actually are the master builders or the architects and the caretakers of our individual and collective future. I encourage each of you to find that gem of meaning in your own life, whatever it might be, that you can use to uplift and inspire other people. And then together, let's forge a new tomorrow. Let's launch a new future that will be free of war, dictatorship, and genocide, that will be blessed with liberty, where all people can fulfill their dreams and their life's purpose. At this point, I take my bow. I say thank you for attending, but there is more to come. First, the final slide, which I will take off once we enter Q&A. Again, you'll see my website is here. My email address is at the bottom. Feel free to contact me. And my book, Flight of Remembrance, is available on Amazon in both print and Kindle versions. And if you download my suggested reading list or put your email into chat so I can send it to you, on the last page of that is an order form, so you can order an autographed copy if you would like. So please do that at this time if you are able. And I will now unshare my screen so that I can take a look at what we have in chat. Okay, we have lots of stuff in chat. Oh my goodness, I'm delighted. Okay, all right, someone said both American and Italian side. So I'm assuming this person, Ralph, had ancestors who served in both the American and the Italian military in World War II. Okay, someone else says, yes, father, pilot, US Air Corps in England. Wow. Yes, lived in areas where the war happened. Oh my. Now, this is Jessica. Jessica, if you can enter something else into chat, I'd appreciate it. Did you yourself live in some country where the war was fought? And if so, where? Maybe you answered further down. If so, I will get to it. Lost my uncle at the Battle of the Bulge. Oh, the Battle of the Bulge. Wow. Ralph says father was from Italy. B says, yes, Pacific and European areas. Jody says, yes, father was in Army, Air Force. Johanna, or Johanna, all served on American side, different branches. And Faye says, yes, my father, although I do not believe that he saw combat, he was conscripted as the war was winding down. Oh, fortunate for him and for your family. Okay, I have an email address here. I do want to remember to save chat at the end so I can gather those addresses. Someone is asking, can the list and instructions to get on the mailing list get sent with the presentation recording, please? So we'll address that to Marty. Marty, if that would be possible, that would be wonderful. Maybe you've already downloaded everything, and if so, you could send it to folks. I would appreciate that very much, and then they can contact me. All right, some more email addresses. Oh, thank you. There's someone telling me that I have a wonderful speaking cadence. You know, that is just so nice to hear. I never get tired of hearing it because, believe me, after hearing ourselves speak over and over and over again, we begin to wonder. Okay, sometimes speakers are too fast to fit in much that is hard to absorb the content. Yeah, I agree. Then Stephen says, Lilo's dad looks like Patrick Swayze. Oh, that's fabulous. I love that observation. And then Al says, unfortunately, the US is in the process. I think I know what you mean, Al, and I sympathize. Some more email addresses. Don't forget Gaza today. Yes, folks, I don't mention Gaza as far as the bombing, as far as the takeovers, as far as the brutality, because frankly, Gaza beggars the imagination. What has happened there to those people. And also, though, what happened to the Israeli hostages? I mean, so much hostility and brutality on both sides. It's hard to imagine how that can be overcome, but we must do something. This was such an inspiring presentation. Thank you so much, Marina. I thank you. That was Marty speaking. Jody, very inspirational. Ralph says, correct to something. And let's see. Oh, Jessica. Okay, Jessica says, family lived in areas where war happened. Poland, Hungary, Germany, not sure where else. Wow. Jessica, your family experienced absolute chaos and turmoil, and probably a lot of tragedy to boot. I hope you didn't lose a lot of family members, but they were right in the eye of the storm. I'm so sorry to hear that. Ralph says, we say never forget, and unfortunately some never forget, for all the wrong reasons. Yes, as long as we have tyrants on earth, there will never be true peace. I say that regretfully, and I agree with you regretfully. I do. And yet, we always have to make an effort. It is our duty as generous Jewish, Christian, whatever religion we are from. We have certain core beliefs and values that we treasure, and we dare never give up. We have to continue to fight dictatorship. We have to continue to fight anything that gets in the way of people being able to lead peaceful and productive lives, even though we may never reach that goal. But maybe someday we will be there. It might be in another world. Jessica says, thank you for such a fabulous presentation and tying it into current events. Yeah, I felt a few years ago when the war in Ukraine began, I had a lot of downtime. All of my programs got canceled. And I had time to think about what was happening and how would I convey the fact that it's not over. It's not over. The brutality, the chaos, the destruction, they're happening again and again and again. And now in Gaza and in other places. And we may never find a way to get over it. But I do believe that for me personally and for my family members, it is our faith in a higher power that gives us the ability to hope, the ability to prevail, and the ability to continue fighting for what we believe is right. And fellow Americans, that is what we continue to do. That is what our country is all about. And we need to preserve that spirit. I am wondering, are there any other questions? Let's see, who can see your messages recording on? Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's down there for me. Okay, I think we are done. So unless somebody types really fast and gets me another question or something in there, I think we are finished. And I'd like to thank you all so much for attending. I enjoy my interactions with you, and I kind of hope next time maybe I'll be there live to talk to you again. I was at the Chelmsford Library, I think it was 2019, speaking to the folks there live, and it was a wonderful, wonderful group of people. So I do hope to see you all in person, face to face, and be able to talk to you again. Take care and have a good night. Marty, do I end it or do you?
I think you will be able to actually, Marina. So thank you so much, and we look forward to having you back again.
Great. Thank you. Oh, save chat. Can you save chat or
Yes,
can I say?
I will save the chat. Absolutely.
Let's see. You know what?
I've
I
got
don't
it.
see an option for me to do that anymore.
Okay. I've got it saved, so I will go ahead and send it along to you.
Wonderful. Okay, Marty, thank you so much for your help, your assistance, and being a friendly face online.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marina. Have a great night.
Bye. You too.
Bye.